Right, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Churley, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, which is all going to be about reducing Microsoft Azure costs, utilizing hybrid license management. On the call today, I will be principally handing over to Christian Seeling from USU, who's going to walk you through how your businesses can utilize the hybrid Azure benefit to reduce your Microsoft Azure spend by up to around about 30%. And the little graphic on the screen gives you an indication of how you can do that. However, Christian will be able to walk through that in a lot more detail. I will come back on at the end with a view to just wrapping up the webinar and then polishing things out. So without further ado, I will pass the screen over to Christian to present.
Thank you, Mark. I try to share my screen, but it's still locked. Maybe you have to do something.
Yeah, I'm just passing over to you now.
Ah, wonderful. Okay. So let's see. As usual, I have to switch. This now it works, I hope. Mark, can you see it? Presentation clearly?
Yep, can see it all there. Thank you, Christian. Yep.
Thank you. So yeah, thanks for joining this joint webinar and for the introduction, Mark. So my name is Christian Seeling from Germany, working at USU for many years in the SAM, software asset management domain. And I'm happy to talk about my current focus interest topic, which is infrastructure cloud and mainly Microsoft Cloud, so Azure. And here we have this hybrid benefit. Everybody knows the Azure hybrid benefit, but what is behind that? And yeah, I want to give the bigger picture of bring your own license management and how to save costs by doing that right. So let's go. I mean, it's meant to be 30 minutes, so I want to go deep in the topic as soon as possible. I want to give you an overview of bring your own license management in general, so not only Azure, not only hybrid benefit, but commercial software in general. Then I'd like to explain a bit in a bit more details the Azure Hybrid Benefit (AHB) means Azure Hybrid Benefit licensing terms for bring your own license. So what are the rules? And then, of course, most interesting might be clever licensing. So how to do it smart, how to do it with cost savings. Yeah, and then finally, I want to highlight a few tools. I will also touch the USU solutions that we offer, but of course, only briefly. So the focus of this webinar is really on being education. What is the challenge of bring your own license management? Yeah, big organizations these days typically have many environments, so they might still have data centers. But yeah, almost every organization has a cloud strategy and already migrated lots of workloads from on-prem to the clouds, mainly Azure, AWS, and Google is what we are seeing. Then also the software as a service world comes comes on top. And so we have a quite complex infrastructure or software world here. And yeah, the main focus for software asset management is on managing compute VMs, also of course containers, more modern stuff, but also databases. So compute VMs, databases are, I think, currently in most projects in the focus. So the big question is, which databases do we have? Which compute VMs do we have? Which containers do we have? And which software is running on these workloads? Plus the important question, which licensing model is used. And if I say licensing model, I mean bring your own license, well known, versus pay-per-use. I call it pay-per-use, or you might also refer to it as a subscription, pay-as-you-go, license included, whatever. I say pay-per-use versus bring your own license. And that's the important differentiation tool, which is not trivial, by the way, to get the information, which workload is bring your own license, which workload is pay-per-use. And for bring your own license, of course, we need to grant software compliance. So we have to know, or we have to use a solution that knows and does the job, the licensing terms for cloud. So I will show that for combinations of software vendors and cloud providers, there can be different licensing rules and also restrictions. The goal is to bring everything together on one screen, literally. So and we need to do that from a software compliance perspective, and also, of course, from a cost management perspective, which becomes more and more important with the pay-per-use models. We don't have to talk about compliance, but only in quotes about costs. Yeah, regarding these licensing terms for cloud, oh, sorry, I forgot one thing. It's nice to have compliance and cost management, but we want to control the situation. We want to master the situation to save money, to use, for example, licenses in the best possible way to reduce the software costs or to reduce the cloud costs. So now let's go into the licensing terms. What are they? What is the playground of this game? So on one side, we have some, you see here some of the biggest software vendors in the world. And at the top, you see the biggest and most important cloud providers. We might be missing Alibaba Cloud here and others, but this is just a simplification to show that, one thing, some of the big software vendors have their own clouds, you know it. So Microsoft, Oracle, IBM, they all have their own cloud environments, and they also use the licensing terms, their own licensing terms for their software to push their own cloud. So of course you can use Oracle licenses in Oracle Cloud in OCI, but you cannot use Oracle licenses in IBM Cloud. There's a big competition, and so the super bird's eye view just shows some of the combinations here. For Microsoft in Microsoft Cloud, of course, this is topic for today as we talk about hybrid benefit. But using Microsoft Windows Server licenses, for example, in other clouds, at least until recently, was quite difficult. There are more and more alliances between software vendors and cloud providers that allow using own licenses here and there. Partly you have to declare that and so on. But it's important to see that there are special licensing rules in this game. Let's make a simple example. If you have, and also come a bit to the hybrid benefit now, to the point. So let's talk a bit more about Windows Server in Azure. And here we have one sample VM which has 24 cores. It is in the US. It's located in the US. It has a certain type, which means a certain sizing, and also it has a certain average uptime. So hours per day, the VM is up on average, let's say. And if you have this situation, you might choose here, I mean, you have the choice in Azure, you might choose own license. And if you do that, it's important to see the impact. The impact is, it's in the end, it's trivial. You have a license demand, so you have to grant compliance. You are even asked by Microsoft when you do this decision if you have own licenses, and you have to check that. So in this case, you need 24 core licenses. If you have a similar workload, also 24 cores, but it only is up for 10 of 24 hours per day on average, then you might not want to use an own license for that, but you say pay-per-use, please. And if you do that, it also has an impact, obviously. So you have the software costs on your cloud bill. And you have it every day together with the infrastructure costs for your VM. You have the position saying licensing costs, and it's in this case 11 euros per day. This is the dialog for the end user, and that's also notable. The end user, so somebody who creates, so some employee of your company, for example, some colleague who creates a Windows Server instance, has to decide about this. And yeah, depending on the specific background and also being optimistic or pessimistic or the information the person has, there might be an arbitrary decision, and this is not so good. Of course, we want to manage that according to existing licenses, according to cost savings. We want to achieve cost savings. And yeah, this is significant. If you look, I mean, we have at USU, we have many customers going to cloud now, many cloud projects, and we always see, roughly this structure here. So half of the costs go actually into the infrastructure, but also, and that's surprising me all the time, operating systems are quite expensive. So for Windows Server, you can easily pay 25%, or typically even more. And also databases and applications are, of course, if you do pay-per-use, come at some cost. So this is a good rule of thumb, and notable software costs can sum up to 50% of your cloud costs, and so it's worth to look into it. And how does it work with the hybrid benefit? So you have the choice. It's a nice bring your own license model, but a specific one, it's nicely manageable. For example, you have the choice. You not always have the choice for all business software, but here you have the choice. If you have own licenses, you can use them if you consider the rules. And what does it mean? Let's assume here per month we have a certain part infrastructure costs and a certain part software costs for bring your own license for pay-per-use. And then this is a total cost per month. And over time we make the decision because we, for example, sign a contract with Microsoft or renew the enterprise agreement, whatever. So we have licenses now. And yeah, then we can toggle that for, at least for Windows Server, it can always be toggled. We have to consider the 90 days rule. So for 90 days, a license, if I make this decision to use an own license, the license is tied to that workload. Even if you would deprovision the workload tomorrow and throw it away, the license is at least theoretically bound for 90 days. And yeah, after some time, the situation might change again, so we can go back to and deactivate hybrid benefit. And yeah, from that very day, we pay the software costs again, the pay-per-use costs. That's the game. Let's go a bit deeper into Windows Server. So what are these magic licensing rules? What are the terms of Azure Windows Server, Azure Hybrid Benefit for Windows Server? Yeah, it's quite straightforward. The picture shows it all. So we have two editions of Windows Server core licenses. So we can have standard core licenses and data center core licenses. For standard, you can use them these licenses either on-premise or in Azure. And for data center, this is an actual benefit. That's something we could also call a dual use right. So at the same time, you can continue using these licenses on premise, and you get spare or additional or dual use rights for Azure. And yeah, that's nice. Of course, there are some prerequisites, so you need software assurance, and that's important. So you have a regular payment of roughly 25% of your license invest. That's a rule of thumb only. Of course, you pay an annual fee of 25%. That's that gives you software assurance, and these are costs that need to be considered, of course, even if you have own licenses. The editions don't matter. So believe it or not, it doesn't matter if you install data center or standard in the cloud, and if you use the one or the other license, editions simply don't matter. So of course, standard licenses are much cheaper. Yeah, and then 90 days rule needs to be considered. I talked about that. And then also very important, we have an 8-core minimum. Some of you might know an additional rule that has just been removed from the terms. In April, there was a big change of the licensing terms. So last month, and maybe that's new for some of you. So there was an additional rule that we needed to license 8-core tiers in 8-core steps, so to speak. So for a 20-core machine, you formerly needed 24 licenses, 3 times 8. And yeah, from May, beginning of May, you only need 20 licenses for such a work. That's new and notable. If we look at SQL Server, the other big product and also expensive product, which is covered by Azure Hybrid Benefit, then that's quite complex. The interesting question, the first question is, which operational models are possible? So which services exist to operate a SQL Server in Azure? And this is, I think, a quite compact and good overview. So first differentiation is infrastructure as a service, so compute VMs, versus platform as a service, the database service or the SQL service of Azure. Yeah, and in the VM world, in the compute world, it depends on the image. So if you can do own licenses or not. There are images with pay-per-use or license included, and others with bring your own license. If you have your own VM image of your company, then typically it's bring your own license. Then also quite interesting for operating SQL is the higher level service. Let's call it like this. So all the database operation stuff is done or mainly done by Microsoft, and you kind of get the database service. And here are different operational models only for the vCore model, which you see here, where we really talk about cores. You can apply and use your core licenses if you have them. The DTU, that means database transaction units, that's a payment only option. And here then you see some performance tiers. In the vCore world, we have editions, and for SQL Server, editions matter. So I will explain the licensing rules on the next slide. But here we have general purpose machines, which are the cheaper and simpler, easier. Oh no, that's the wrong term. Lightweight, let's say, SQL instances, and you can have business critical with more performance and additional services. Yeah, and here you can use own license as a Hybrid Benefit. And how does that work for SQL Server? Also one slide which aims at explaining the licensing terms. Here we have to distinguish editions. For SQL Server, we have standard edition and enterprise edition. And again, we talk about core licenses. Once again, you need software assurance, so roughly 25% per year. And if you have such databases, then as we saw, they can be general purpose or hyperscale, which for licensing is the same, or they can be business critical. And now the rules. So if you have such a database here, general purpose or hyperscale, and you activate Hybrid Benefit, then it's 1-to-1. So one core license standard covers one cloud core of such a database. And likewise, one enterprise core license covers one business critical core in the cloud. And then there's a cross relationship. So with one enterprise core license, you can cover 4 cores of general purpose. And likewise, you need 4 standard licenses to cover 1 core in business critical. Not so difficult, I think. And yeah, all these slides, you will get them at the end, and also a nice cheat sheet, so you don't have to take notes or keep everything in mind. Here, additions matter, 90 days rule applies likewise, and software assurance as well. It's not so easy to turn hybrid benefit on and off for the SQL service, for the PaaS service. So you have to decide upfront what you want to do. Let's look at to make it more transparent and get a feeling what that means. Let's assume a certain database, general purpose, 16 cores, and let's look at the costs. So of course the list price, you might have a good, far better rate, of course, with your contract. But per month you would pay for this database, you would pay 2,600 euros. If you use an own license, you get, in this case, 37% discount. Notable again, 37% are software costs. Yeah, and this reduces your cost by roughly 1/3. At the same time, you need the licenses. You need 16 standard core licenses, or you could also use 4 enterprise core licenses with software assurance. Now, again, an overview, trying to summarize everything briefly. This will also be, I think, on your cheat sheet, which you get later on. So we talked about additions. Software assurance is needed 90 days. For 90 days, licenses are tied to the workload if you use them. License model cannot be changed for SQL Server. You have to decide upfront. For Windows Server, it is possible, so you can optimize later on. There is a grace period of 180 days during which you can use the licenses on both ends, on premise and in Azure, in parallel. So there is for that period, for half a year, there is a dual use right for all these licenses. We have a 8-core minimum for Windows Server, 8 core per workload. Also quite interesting. So if you have a 2-core VM and use own licenses, you need 8 core licenses. And you can see this as core-based. Why don't you use your 8 core licenses for an 8-core or for 20-core workload? Why do you use it for a 2-core VM? Isn't it better to use pay-per-use for that workload? That's already optimization. And we have an actual benefit. So we have the dual use right for data center. You get additional cores for Azure, and also some licensing rules for dedicated hosts. I think that will that's too much for this brief webinar. I rather want to go into some sample calculations, which are quite interesting, and talk about clever licensing. So render by, that's the old story. What should we do? And here we have some extract from the price list. So we have a region, let's say Brazil South. We have different types of machines or sizes, implying in particular the number of cores. And then we have an hourly price tag. So this is the hourly price, including Windows Server in this case. And so we can calculate annual costs with an assumption about the uptime. You pay, I mean, it's pay per use here, this calculation. So you pay per hour. But if it's up all the time, the machine runs 24/7, then you will have this to pay this amount per year. Now let's look at the other option, using own licenses. Here, for all these small machines, we have the 8-core minimum for Windows Server. And yeah, I would recommend to at least, I mean, even if you have the licenses, you pay an annual fee for software assurance. And this is 135 euros. Yeah, and then we can calculate the difference. And here you see it graphically. So of course, in all these cases, own licenses pay off. You only have the the ridiculous 135 euros software assurance. And of course, this can be completely different in your case, because yeah, in this case, we just assume we have spare licenses and we don't count them in this calculation. So if you have to purchase licenses, or you want to use depreciation rules also, then it can be different. And also the assumption that VM runs all the time might be wrong. So if it's just started once a week or so and used for 2 hours, then again, the picture is completely different, because the pay-per-use costs are much lower. Another interesting aspect for optimization or clever licensing, the regions matter. So we looked at Brazil South. You see the same workloads on this slide here. And we see, yeah, first of all, we see we distinguish here base price, which means infrastructure only. And if you would use Linux as an operating system, you would only have to pay this here. Yeah, then we have the including Windows Server price, and this gives us a difference. So how much is the operating system? How much is Windows Server? What is the part of Windows Server? And here you see these typical numbers. So between, yeah, in this case here, yeah, it's roughly between 27 and 35%, and this is quite typical. Yeah, but we wanted to talk about regions, and regions, the prices can differ, and they can differ significantly. You see it here. What we did here was searching for the cheapest price or the cheapest region for this specific machine or type of machine. And you see the incredible differences. So between Brazil South, which might already be cheap, I don't know, and these cheapest regions. So it's worth to think about that as well. And yeah, you might want to, if possible, move the workload, but at least use the licenses where you have the highest costs. So if you know that regions make a difference in the pay-per-use rate that you pay, then it's also logical to say, okay, let's use own licenses where we would have for the most expensive regions without moving the workload. I mean, the cloud infrastructure team might complain if you request to move a workload, just for this reason. Of course, we have to stay practical. Yeah, you can kind of move the license, which just means turning off hybrid benefit on one workload and turn it on for a different workload without any impact on operations. That's quite important, I think. Yeah, then I mean, we are a bit short in time, so maybe I will just pick a few things. Yeah, I recommend starting with low-hanging fruits. So there are some quite simple things which you could do to get started with this topic in your environment. So for example, we saw that Windows Server Data Center brings additional use rights. So you don't have to know your spare licenses for data center. You just can count your available data center licenses with software assurance, and they can be used for Azure. So this is quite an easy calculation. And it's yeah, I frequently see our customers, if they don't manage the topic, then they typically have the expensive data center core licenses, and at the same time they rent a lot of Windows servers in Azure, so they don't use the own licenses which are there. Yeah, and then another recommendation, yeah, if you compare pay-per-use with bring your own license or hybrid benefit, then you should of course at least calculate or consider the software assurance or maintenance costs which you have. Of course, you could start without impacting operations. So moving workloads, we talked about that, might be very tricky and maybe not feasible. But changing the licensing model, even if you don't do it, but somebody in the infrastructure will do it on your request, that should be quite easy. Yeah, and then rules of thumb help a lot already. So you could also, without exact science or total cost calculations, you could say, start saying, okay, if the machine idles a lot, only 25% uptime, then I use pay-per-use, and so on. That's it for the low-hanging fruits, and we have some do's and don'ts. I don't have the time to go through them. You will get them afterwards, so please, if you like, have a look at this on your own. I would rather like to briefly go through some tools. So the most basic tool, which you will know, is the hybrid benefit calculator, which is quite useful also to understand the licensing rules. And here you can play with numbers. So in this case, I say I have 2 standard licenses for SQL Server, and I want to spin up a certain workload. Here again, you see the uptime. That's always part of the calculation. And then, yeah, it tells you how many of such workloads you could license with it, and how much you would save, and so on. That's very basic, the calculator. Microsoft also comes with a Power BI extension or plugin, which gives some reporting for Azure Hybrid Benefit. It directly connects to Azure and extracts data. And here you see an example where screenshot where you see all your workloads. You see if Hybrid Benefit is currently enabled or not. And then you see also the cores or virtual CPUs here, and also how many you would use if you would do own license, and so on. Some more information, some overview, also quite useful, I think. And of course, I wanted to give you a short introduction what we are doing with our solutions. So we have the USU Discovery Data Hub, how we call it, and it's our big data management platform. And here we have connectors not only for Azure, but also for AWS and Google and many SaaS solutions and so on, always growing number of connectors. And here you can not only extract the data, you can also transform it before you load it to the other USU solutions. So it's our central data platform. And here you see an extract from Azure with some samples SQL VMs. You also see the hybrid benefit property here. So you get it from Azure if it's pay as you go, or Azure hybrid use benefit. This is a legacy term, by the way. So you see get the licensing model. Of course, everything needs to be normalized and translated so that it's understandable. And that's what we do then in the USU license management. Here you get it in a nicer presentation, of course. You can see how many Windows Server VMs use the hybrid benefit versus pay-per-use or license included. You get information about the cores as well as core waste indications, where you kind of waste cores due to the core minimum, and how many, of course, also the licensing world, the commercial world is part of license management. So you see how many spare licenses you have if you are compliant and so on. For each workload, you get the detailed information. You also get straight away the information about hybrid benefit, Windows Server, SQL Server, yes or no. So that's quite easy to filter, to report on. And you also, of course, we also have the cloud costs in the solution. So also the costs, you can bring together costs of Azure, AWS, and Google currently, and have them in a normalized view. We just classify across the providers. We say it's database costs, backup, network, whatever. And all the daily costs are behind that, all the details, if you click on it. And you will know it sums up. Cloud costs sum up easily. This is one example from the details of behind the costs. And I already talked about uptime for the VMs. They are built on an hourly basis, as you know. And so that's quite interesting, I think, from the billing data, from the daily billing data, we can see the uptime. So it's kind of a lightweight monitoring or billing-based monitoring, if you like. So here you see some workloads which are up almost 24 hours on average, almost all the time. And we see others which are just maybe have been started once or so. So this is already quite interesting also for the decision own license or not. And that brings me to the end, and also back to Mark, I think. I just put this tiny picture here so that I not forget to mention the cheat sheet, but I already mentioned it a couple of times, I think. So yeah, Mark.
Perfect. All right, well, Christian, thank you ever so much. I'm conscious that we've run a little bit over. So just to wrap up, obviously, as Christian said, we'll be sending out a cheat sheet with some guidance from the webinar. We will also send out and share the slides and recording information. And if there's any questions that have come in, either during the webinar or that anyone would like to send in following the webinar, we'll summarize those up and send those out. So thank you, Christian, for your time this morning. Thank you for those that have joined. And yes, we'll get all that information out to you as soon as possible. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for participation. Bye.